Well, we're in the final module of media law, and in your final chapter of the text, we look at the law of public relations, freelancing, and new media entrepreneurship. Now, of course, all of the areas we've looked at earlier are relevant to freelancing journalists, people working in PR because they engage with the media and are often publishers within organisations or to the community at large, and to new media entrepreneurs, because if you're starting up your own business in the area of media, whether it's as a news provider or in some new application or software program to do with the media and news, then you need to know about media laws as well. So all of those earlier things are relevant, but given that many journalism graduates and many newcomers to the media now have to make their living through small business or contract work, and they are less likely or less frequently able to get journalism positions with mainstream media, it's important that they understand the laws that control these other areas. Now, the law students doing the course would recognise the main topics of this chapter. Many of them are very similar to topics to do with business law, and they are a quick look at some of the topic areas you may have covered in whole subjects in a law degree. But I think rarely would you have had the opportunity to think about them all in a single situation of something like a media operator trying to navigate them through their work. And hopefully you find that a very valuable exercise and case study in doing so. And this is because at a global level, media law has been extended to so many other careers now, because everybody has become a publisher and so many more people are now trying to make a business out of the media. What we've found arising, as you see in the first slide here, are special contexts for defamation, contempt, and confidentiality, the big ticket items of media law. We can't forget copyright as well there, because so many new media ventures are tempted to try to borrow or steal the works of others because their revenue model is such that, that they feel they need to do that to try to make ends meet. So this is where we start to look at other perspectives from these business or freelancing or entrepreneurship angles on privacy, intellectual property and copyright. So while the journalist might be approaching these issues wanting to intrude into someone's privacy, perhaps wanting to borrow the work of others, perhaps the new media entrepreneur or the public relations practitioner wants to protect the privacy of a certain group, wants to enshrine and enforce their own rights over the copyright of their freelancing work or their new media outputs in their new media business. So these occupations also have all sorts of digital dimensions to them. These days, those sorts of occupations, PR, freelancing, and new media entrepreneurship, transcend borders. So the journalist working in, say, a newspaper in country New South Wales might be mainly concerned with New South Wales and Australian law in a certain area. These days, the public relations practitioner might just as likely be associated with some international PR consultancy, or a freelancer might one day be producing material, stories for that regional newspaper, but the next day might be filing to some international blogging site or perhaps to an international major media organisation. And of course, new media entrepreneurs are looking for a revenue stream anywhere in the world, and it could be that theirs is based around some interest area or some expertise that they have rather than a geographical boundary. So, for example, you might be a snowboarding enthusiast and decide to create a new blog which is underwritten in some way through crowdfunding based around snowboarding internationally. Well, of course, your audience is going to come from countries throughout the world, and you would need to be across the laws of the different jurisdictions in that new media venture, but you'd also need to understand the business law surrounding this jurisdiction that you're working in. And those business laws that start to impact on these people who aren't necessarily associated or aren't just an employee with a major media organisation, they're things like the law of contract, which itself constitutes a whole course at law school. Negligence, which is probably the main topic area in a whole subject at law school around torts. Consumer law and employment law, which can also be whole courses. And clearly today and in the chapter, we can't go into that level of depth, and neither should we. But it's important that people in media who are engaging in business activities need to know a little bit about these areas. Contract law, for example, is vital to freelance journalists, but also to public relations practitioners who are doing contract work for clients, and also for new media entrepreneurs who might be contracting out their services or need to develop contracts for new employees as they expand. And so the law of contract, which has both a strong common law tradition, in other words, it's been developed through the courts, but is also modified in various ways by legislation, then you need to be across that law of contract, because you might be at the wrong side of a contract, either as an employer or perhaps as a freelancer or client, contract worker. The law of negligence, the tort of negligence, is basically around that area of a civil wrong. And negligence centres upon you having a duty of care to somebody in some way that you breach or you neglect to properly guard them against some injury or wrongdoing that happens to them through your negligence. Now, this is a very important area for anyone dealing with others or anyone operating in a professional context. So you can be negligent both by leaving obstructions in your office that people might trip over and injure themselves as they enter your workspace. That can be an action for negligence. But so too can your professional competence or incompetence in your work. So you can be sued for negligence over overlooking or disregarding or not paying heed to some important element in your work that you've done for a client where you did have a duty of care to them and you have been negligent in not attending to that aspect. So the textbook talks a little bit about that in a nutshell. We've talked a little bit earlier in the course about consumer law and about the area particularly to do with corporations in this country where they're required not to engage in misleading and deceptive conduct under consumer law, under the Australian consumer law. Now, this is very, very important, particularly if we're dealing with some kind of news service or we are selling advertising associated with certain benefits or assertions that might be made in our work. So please have a close read of that explanation of the misleading and deceptive conduct elements and the false representation elements of the consumer law, which certainly apply in the area of advertising, but more so are being found to apply in news dissemination. Employment law is also important, and we've learned through earlier parts of the textbook and in our learning problems about law related to dismissal of employees and whether that might be unfair. And we've discussed whether someone's misuse of social media might justify their dismissal, and whether they could appeal that under employment law through a body like the Fair Work Commission through to the federal and perhaps higher courts if they are dismissed from their job over their use of social media. Of course, this is just one area of employment law that might impact you in your work as a PR consultant, a freelancer, or as a new media entrepreneur. There are many, many others to do with employment contracts and various industrial and labour laws. There's also a miscellany of topics covered in that chapter to do with social media policies. They may or may not lead to somebody's dismissal, but it's important that social media policies are understood, as is their regulation and enforcement. The escalation procedures, well, what happens if we start to get a media law or some other legal problem in a media-related business? What policies does a company have in place, or even a small business or partnership if you're in one of these occupations? What procedures do you have in place for determining a legal risk and then through working through legal advice and what policies are there for employees to follow as part of your escalation procedures? And of course, the big area of insurance is crucial to professionals working in any of these areas, and if they're working as small businesses, because all of these areas of media law can be included in insurance policies. Sometimes they're very expensive, but that expense can be worthwhile when you don't have a large media corporation underwriting the risk attached to your defamation, breach of confidence, breach of copyright, and these other actions that we've learned about. There can also be other important regulations that control businesses in whatever enterprise they're in, but also some specifically related to media. So if, for example, you were starting a small radio station, you would need to be well aware of the Australian Communication and Media Authority, the ACMA, its regulations around the licensing and the license conditions attached to that. But if you're forming some other company, you need to be aware of the corporations law and the various regulations of directors' powers and duties in companies and securities regulations. Well, that's a nutshell summary, and any law students would appreciate how broad brush that was. But nevertheless, it's there as a chapter of the text, so you can dip your toe in the water and start to get an understanding now as we reach the final stage of media law that it can extend its tentacles into so many other areas of business and contract work out there in society. So I hope you've found this particular module of use if you are entering into those occupations. But if you're a journalist, remember, you could finish up there because we don't know where our career is going to take us in this exciting, new, digital, globalised era of media.